Good afternoon to all of you from Manila. Welcome to Asia Clean Energy Forum and to this first session under the track Building Energy Sector Resilience. Let us quickly look at the definition of resilience. As the dictionary says, the resilience means the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions, in simple words. This clearly means the resilience will encompass a broad spectrum of events. For example, we are witnessing right now in the Asia Clean Energy Forum, for the first time in its history of 15 years, ASF has gone virtual. It is resilient to COVID pandemic, like any other pandemic, thanks to the immense developments in information communication technologies, as you can see. As for the energy system, this includes many difficult conditions emanating from various events. If we take the most recent example, as I said, completely unexpected, the COVID-19 pandemic. This resulted in many difficult situations. To name a few, sudden drop in manpower at work in the electricity utilities or electricity supply industry, inability to move around due to lockdown affecting urgent maintenance work in the systems, repairs, as well as, of course, rehabilitation work, which are due to make sure that the systems run in time and reliably, and new installations, which are required for future demand to supply the future demand. The third, drop in revenue collection, which is a major issue at the moment, leading to defaulting payments to service providers like generators and transmission service providers and all the other service providers in the electricity supply industry. Fourth, additional financial burden due to increase in precautionary measures to avoid spread of virus and to abide by the requirements stipulated by the governments not envisaged before. If you take other difficult situations under normal operating conditions in the energy sector, there can be situations like those affecting the environment, like flooding, the cyclones, severe droughts, or man-made disasters like communal or political charged riots, etc. Of course, all these eventually lead to damaged installations and affected workforce. We need to try our best to improve and strengthen energy sector resilience to withstand and come out of these difficult conditions or situations. Of course, at the end, we need to bear in mind to balance the costs and the benefits of these measures and interventions and eventual recovery of these costs from the beneficiaries of these energy services. In all these, we should never forget the great need for social inclusion in all our approaches and solutions. In this regard, we need to rethink the way we plan and design the energy systems, managing its operations, including under emergency conditions. To help us in the energy sector in this process, fortunately, we have a whole world of new and innovative high-level technologies, and they are developing and improving all the time exponentially. Increasing decentralization of the energy system, use of more and more renewable energy sources, and accompanying smart grid, smart energy system designs, and digitalization play key roles in this particular process. Also, increasingly, these solutions in the energy sector are becoming cross-sectoral, like energy transport, like electric vehicles, energy agriculture irrigation, like solar water pumping, high voltage distribution with drip irrigation, and energy coupled with water usage efficiency. And energy health, like renewable energy for remote clinics, planning for pandemics like COVID, what we have already experienced. Energy education, awareness building, training, and retraining the workforce for new technologies, etc. You also need to need innovation in business models, financing, and regulatory regimes in the energy sector part of this solution. We have many examples within ADB DMCs and in all on interventions addressing many of these issues. New challenges continue to emerge, and we need to be ready to confront them. We in the energy sector are capable of taking up these challenges and confront them successfully if we all work together. I'm sure ASF is one such forum which brings us all together to discuss these solutions. Hope we will hear these stories throughout Asia Clean Energy Forum and this track in particular. Thanks so much, Agya.
Thank you, Priyank. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 4.1 of track 4, which is focusing on resilience of energy systems. Priyanka provided a very interesting background on what this entire track is going to look at. But in this session specifically, we're going to focus on importance of planning for making the energy sector more resilient, so that it's able to absorb different kinds of shocks, anticipate it, adapt to the shocks, and also recover quickly when a shock eventually takes place. In this session, I'm very happy to have with us 3 speakers and 2 panelists who will share their experiences on using various planning methodologies and tools to strengthen this energy sector resilience. So without any further delay, I will request our first speaker is Ms. Malavika Bambawale, who's the Managing Director and Head of the Asia Pacific region of NG Impact, to make her presentation. Malavika, you've got 5-10 minutes with you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Argya. Hi, everyone. A very warm welcome to this virtual ASEP. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about building resilience to climate risks in business operations and infrastructure. And I know I have only a short period of time, so I'm going to briefly talk about categorizing climate risks, and then talk about the levers that we've looked at to mitigate these risks, and then share some case examples of how we've been doing some projects in this space. So first of all, climate risks, as you know, are growing, and the current pandemic has dramatically exposed the vulnerability of our supply chains, infrastructure, etc. But the pandemic has an end in sight, and climate change presents a more permanent threat. It exposes us to challenges of unprecedented scale, and the number of severity of these is only increasing and growing. So, for example, this World Bank study actually shows us that since 1980, the number of climate change disasters has grown 3 times, and their costs have risen by 600% to nearly $200 billion a year, and that's growing dramatically even more. So, so these risks are actually challenging because these climate risks vary a lot. So while companies and cities have been increasingly adopting sustainability goals and embracing these goals, they have been slow to actually integrate climate risk into overall strategies and investment decisions. So the delay is basically due to 2 key issues. One is a failure to understand these risks, which we call a knowledge gap. And the second is the hurdles in our system to execute on them, which we call the implementation gap. So basically, first, let's talk about the knowledge gap, right? So, I mean, the risks we face occur on different time horizons. Some are acute disruptive risks, such as dramatic sort of pandemics and floods, whereas others are sort of gradually growing, such as rising inequality or softening consumer demand, etc. So it's difficult to really translate these risks into action. And the second is the implementation gap, which means that these types of challenges, like rising sea levels or frequent fires, typically fall outside of our standard operating procedures. So our systems are geared to maximize efficiency, not to sort of create buffer for some random event that might happen in the future, right? Also, the other thing is that these challenges require some kind of collective action to take place, whereas we are all designed to act alone. So basically, this matrix presents to you like a guide for organizations to assess their risks. And the less predictable the risk, the greater the need for necessary intelligence. And similarly, the more severe the risk, the greater the need to overcome those operational barriers by flexing the value chains or forming partnerships to share the costs and risks. So let's look at how we looked at unlocking these knowledge and implementation gaps. So we looked at primarily 3 key levers. The first is technology. Now, technology is obviously a big lever, and it's advancing rapidly over the last several years in terms of how, helping us diagnose, track, map, and model using information. And there's ample examples here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've used technology to unlock these gaps in certain cities and areas. But there are also some great examples of sort of public databases that are making themselves available. So for example, I believe WRI has created this tool called Aqueduct Floods, which provides quantification of property damage. So I'll talk about this technology lever a bit later, but on the knowledge side, but also on the implementation side, technology helps us provide information that creates visibility in our supply chains down the line. And a recent example is a case from New York's health group, which put blockchain to work during COVID to basically connect to distributed networks of suppliers outside of their traditional procurement system. The second is the operational barrier. Now, or the operational unlock actually. Now, investing in operations firstly requires financing, and a lot of knowledge gaps are related to this financing. So we don't properly price in the costs and risks of climate change and the benefits that accrue from planning, right? So a study, for example, shows that every $1 invested in infrastructure can save you $6 in future costs. So, and I know there are certain committees like the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is filling this gap now. So that helps us plan and make investments in operations properly. So we need to reframe the investment criteria for capital projects with climate risks in mind. And we also need to, on the operational side of things, we also need to build buffers to protect from risk. So we need to diversify our suppliers. We need to increase flexibility. We have to have more localized supply chains. And finally, we need to build more long-term partnerships with our suppliers to create resilience for all. And the final unlock that we looked at was partnerships and coalitions. So, the interesting thing is that while communities come together in a very nice way in the event of a disaster, but it is far more difficult to rally that support at a planning stage, but that's when it's most needed. So, and here we've looked at, for example, what are the ways in which we can create business models that make it successful for people or, profitable for people to actually create partnerships. So for example, an energy as a service model is some kind of a symbiotic relationship where a project developer can develop their own and own basically in a host site and deliver energy as a service. So that part of the risk is undertaken by the project developer. And similar such sort of shared critical infrastructure models where the developer makes a microgrid in the host site and then shares the risks, right? And there are also interesting circular business opportunities where local businesses come together to create, symbiotic relationship where one business's waste becomes another business's input. So there are some examples there that I'll also share. So with this framework in mind, let me jump into examples. So first is an example where NGO was actually involved in this region called Ile-de-France, which is north of Paris. And we basically used a tool where we create a digital twin of a city. So basically we simulated the entire urban, spatial design of this area and incorporated about 10,000 different data sets to model 12,000 kilometers of road and about 2.5 million buildings into this database, basically help citizens and create services for them. And this was the first public-private citizen type of data and service platform where citizens can click in and find information on their building and on their services. And they can use this in amazing kinds of ways. Like, for example, they can figure out energy generation on their rooftop, or they can figure out the best low carbon way to get to work, or they can find out where traffic is peaking and find a better way to get to work or whatever, find workspaces to share, and things like quality of air, exposure to noise, etc. So that, and now I believe with COVID, actually this database also started to incorporate information on COVID and hotspots and doctors and all of that. So that's been a really interesting, project. There's another example of the Flemish administration where we've been involved. Now this region actually suffers a lot from the effects of climate change, such as droughts and heat waves and floods. And every year there's millions spent on compensating for damage. So here what we've done is we basically did climate simulation modeling to determine the impacts of climate change and to figure out what are some of the toolkits that can be used to mitigate those risks. So for example, looking at water storage and infiltration in an urban context, or looking at, for example, green roofs and facades, or revegetation to basically help mitigate some of these effects that this region is facing. Another similar, I would say, example is sort of, again, urban planning is the city of Ranchi in Jharkhand in India, where we are again looking at basically the vulnerability that this, so we're looking at about 650 acres of land in this greenfield smart city, and looking at what is the vulnerability and risk to climate change. And again, looking at models to aid the mitigation solutions. So we, for example, looking at the development of an intelligent transport system and ICT through the entire city, and specifically at certain key infrastructure development in that 650-acre area. Another example, and so those were some examples of how we use technology to gain more information and improve implementation. Then there's an example of basically coalitions and partnerships. So this, in 2018, basically in the port of Dunkirk, where there was, this was facing some closures of some refineries, etc. And so the local businesses basically came together to map the energy, water, and material streams generated by the local ecosystem. And by modeling this and then the cost savings and environmental benefits, they basically found a business model through which they could share these energy, water, material streams. So as I mentioned, there's a very symbiotic relationship in which they were able to exchange resources, reduce environmental impact at a fraction of the price. So that's another sort of example. And another example is the Simiyu region of Tanzania. I don't have a lot more time, but basically we modeled the water supply chain and looked at where were the specific vulnerabilities in the water supply chain in this region. And then our solutions included things like addition of smart agriculture as a solution to overcome those vulnerabilities in the supply chain. So and then of course we also do things like help this island, which is in New Caledonia, Lifo Island, become 100% renewable by utilizing their solar and wind and putting in some energy storage, basically, to overcome their dependency on fuel oil. So I'll just wrap up now. Basically, what I'm trying, so I think I've given you some examples of how to use technology, how to use partnerships to and operations to improve resilience. And I just want to say that I think it's interesting that we should use pivotal moments to accelerate change. And COVID-19 has basically shown us and illustrated the magnitude of impact from these kinds of disasters and enabled a mindset shift to better plan for systemic risk. So let's capitalize on that. I think people have understood that climate change could be a similar and worse, much worse, and a never stopping kind of problem. So it's an important decade to act on climate change. And secondly, I think we've also seen that a lot of our clients have a lot of downtime, and some of them are starting to use these low volume periods to basically embrace these new projects. So yeah, with that, I would say the time is now and we need to act now. Thank you.
Extremely useful experiences and actually highlighting the importance of understanding risk. I think that's essential, absolutely. And the recent work by TCFD on disclosing risk, how can you use that for decision-making purposes? Also, thanks for highlighting the partnership approach, which is critical when we talk about resilience. And I hope to come back to it later on in the question and answers to discuss further. I'll move on to my second speaker, which is Dr. Rihanna Moeti, Senior Research Fellow from University of Melbourne, Australia. Rihanna, you.
Thank you, Arya, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and welcome to this session. In this presentation, I'd like to outline some of the main elements of a new study being conducted by myself from EEE and my colleague Krishna Hort from the Nossal Institute for Public Health at the University of Melbourne. The aims of the study are to develop an integrated and multidisciplinary approach to strengthening urban and community resilience to climatic, biological, economic, and social challenges with a focus on gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI. The context is that the Asia and Pacific have become majority urban for the first time in history in 2019, with more than 50% of the region's population living in cities. And this type of rapid urbanization presents a growing and compounded health risk related to air pollution, communicable diseases, and uneven access to basic infrastructure and essential services. Our infrastructure, which is by and large intended to connect people and enable the movement and accessibility of information, goods, and services, these same qualities can also make it easier for contagions to spread. And while infrastructure innovation has emerged as a priority to ensure that the physical systems remain resilient in the face of human-made disasters and so on, cities are not necessarily equipped to face biological disasters. And this is just a quick picture of Mumbai Central Station. And you can see the population, the teeming population, infrastructure, and so on. Just a little quick view of some of the challenges that we face. And in this COVID-19 response strategies that have been undertaken, we are effectively undertaking a massive experiment where we disrupt the entire economy, how we work and live. And this has multiple and far-reaching implications. Obviously, health, economy, education in my area of young people, and for infrastructure, to gender equality and social inclusion. And the study aims to draw from some of the emerging lessons of the strategies put in place to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and incorporate this into our understanding of an integrated urban resilience. A couple of areas I want to quickly look at in terms of implications or impacts is one is electricity demand. This is an IEA study that's recently published, and where electricity demand has been significantly reduced by more than 20%, with increased residential demand far outweighed by reductions in commercial and industrial operations. And you can see this is over so many days after lockdowns in basically worldwide. And I think the IEA marked it from mid-March to mid-April, and that's the change in electricity demand. The other area I want to look at is the impact on gender, women, and vulnerable groups. The United Nations has described a horrifying surge in domestic violence, and this is in all countries without exception. We also know a majority of frontline healthcare workers are women. Social distancing measures have had a large impact on female employment because it tends to affect industries where women predominate, such as in the service sector, in the food retail sector, and so on. Women have increasing unpaid work burden under these lockdown conditions, with an increase in care responsibilities. And it's not only gender and women, but also other vulnerable groups have been affected, such as people with disabilities, so people with severe underlying health problems, isolated populations, and so on. Now, a critical element in the preparation and response to these disasters, including biological emergencies, is the extent, strength, and the resilience of the health system and healthcare infrastructure. Better health is a measure of progress in diverse dimensions of sustainable energy, cities, transport, and other infrastructure system. This slide on your, which is on just up here, establishes a correlation between the quality of infrastructure and the Global Health Security Index, and quite a significant positive correlation there. That's a Global Health Security Index, and that's the quality of overall infrastructure. This was put together by the AIIB. Now, and this indicates that infrastructure development is a key part of health security and epidemic preparedness. Now, building on this work, the next slide examines the correlation between general infrastructure and health security by levels of gender equality. While the correlation is positive in both cases, that is for gender equality, which is below median, and gender equality above or equal to median levels, it also indicates that in countries with higher gender equality, investments in infrastructure may have a greater impact on improving health security. As you can see, this graph is sharper than this one here. So for increases in the quality of infrastructure here, the implications of the impact on health security is higher. Now, the study also draws on resilience guidelines and concepts that are multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral. One of the key guidelines that we will base the study on is the OECD Guidelines for Resilience and Systems Analysis, which was published in 2014. And these guidelines take a systems approach that enables the complexities and interlinkages between different sectors and components of systems to be considered, and addresses a broad range of potential risks. So it looks at different types of risks, shocks, and stresses, sustainable livelihood. It's based on a sustainable livelihoods framework. It assesses 6 different types of capital: financial, human, natural, physical, political, and social. It looks at 3 different capacities: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, and promotes participatory processes. We'll also look at resilience from different perspectives, such as an urban planning and disaster perspective, where we'll focus on planning, preparation, reduction of risk, and institutional and planned responses. And of course, from a health perspective, where we'll focus on interaction between the formal health system or health services and the communities served by the health system. And a community perspective, which I'll come back to later on. And of course, a power systems resilience perspective will be a central aspect of this, and we'll our working definition here is the one given by the UK Energy Research Centre, and we'll develop that to the specific urban integrated urban resilience context. And we will also assess various ways in which a system can be made resilient, smarter, make the network more responsive, stronger, upgrade existing infrastructure, bigger, build newer infrastructure such as transmission lines, substations, and so on, or elements of these integrated, and so forth. Now, we'll be drawing all this together in an understanding of community resilience in an urban setting. And we've identified some criteria, and these criteria will be further prioritized and developed through the course of the study. And these include employment and income, access to information and communication, early warning systems and shelters, skilled labor to bring the systems back online, access to backup local power generation, such as microgrids and so on, ongoing operation of and access to health facilities, water, sanitation, transport, healthcare, food, and housing, and most importantly, the capacity, especially of local government institutions, to respond and to adapt. And all this will be based on disaggregated data disaggregated by sex, as well as vulnerabilities, prioritized in a particular, given the context, geographical context, for example. And we will apply a gender analysis and a social inclusion framework to analyze this data. And finally, some key messages. I think this is seemingly obvious, but it needs to be stated. Being better prepared and learning how to become more resilient is a more viable long-term option than waiting for disasters to occur. The COVID-19 pandemic, as the previous speaker has pointed out, has shown the importance of multi-sectoral approaches required for building resilience. Preparedness requires an integrated approach, combining infrastructure, service delivery, and population response initiatives. And resilience, very importantly, depends on the capacity of government to provide effective leadership. And this is strategies, policies, planning, and so on. And I think the key underlying and main thrust of all this is that the lessons from this pandemic will give us an opportunity to build back better, but not only to build back better, but to build back so that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Rihanna, for that excellent presentation, and most importantly for highlighting some of the critical areas. First of all, looking at urban, which itself requires very multidisciplinary approach, as you rightly pointed out. Secondly, talking about the social and the gendered vulnerabilities issues and the need to look at it and address it if we really want transformational change to happen. And third, but not the least, is the whole focus on local level community resilience. And we have seen in the current pandemic that communities which were just better prepared, had better capacity, better relationship with local governments, have definitely performed much better compared to other communities. So it does boil down at the very individual unit level of a community on how to strengthen resilience. So thanks for that. And we'll get back to you again during the question and answer session. The third presenter today is Mr. Sijuan Guo, who's a senior engineer on power system planning and operation analysis from China Energy Engineering Group, Electric Power Design Institute Limited. I just want to make sure if Sijuan is available online. He was facing a problem to connect. I don't see him. Okay, I don't see him. So in interest of time, we will move forward, but it's a real pity because he had a very excellent presentation focusing on, in China, how the whole shift from a reactive approach of risk management to a proactive approach, and looking at some of the natural hazard considerations, not just in the planning stage of energy sector, but also in implementation, maintenance, operations, and how do you make sure this whole risk management approach is looked in a continuity. And it's unfortunate this is not able to join. However, we will definitely upload this presentation, and we request participants to kindly go through the presentation, and you can get back to him in person if you need further clarification. So in the interest of time, I'll move on to our two panelists. The first panelist is Mr. Toru Kubo, who's the principal climate change specialist at Southeast Asia Department of Asian Development Bank. So Toru, please, if you can provide some remarks in the presentation, but also share your overall experiences looking at the energy sector and resilience discussion. Over to you, Toru.
Thank you, Argo. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to everyone for joining this, this session and inviting me as a panelist. I'll keep my remarks short so that we have enough time for Q&A. Thank you to the excellent presentations by Malavika and Rehana. I really enjoyed that. I hope Zushuan can log in still so we can hear his experience in China. I think what needs to be said has been said by the presenters, so I don't aim to be comprehensive in my remarks. I'll just mention 3 points that I noticed from this morning's presentation and also the resource speakers today. Number one is, I think we heard in the opening plenary that the resilience of energy systems is actually so critical for the resilience of the communities. And we're seeing such a stark divide between the communities that have had stable basic social services, including, for example, electricity supply, being able to respond better and the damage reduced from COVID, for example, whereas for other communities, we've had much higher reduced economic activity and also limited education opportunities. So the need to look at the vulnerabilities that Rehana mentioned, in particular, the most vulnerable communities and the support needed, and to be able to build that into the infrastructure planning that the governments undertake, and also the support provided by ADB and development organizations. This prioritization, the identification of the higher risks and prioritization is very important, because it is very simple for us to say that we need redundancy in the system, but that all costs money, as Priyantha mentioned in the scene setting talk. And many of our countries have difficulty providing equitable energy access in the first place. And then to provide redundancy is a very high ask that is costly. For example, just to mention what we are doing in ADB, we have a large program coming up in Java to help energy access and improve the reliability and resilience of the grid. And that will look at the particularly vulnerable areas and try to enhance or deepen the automation and digitization of the systems so that we're looking and identifying the higher risk of climate impacts and other disasters on the grid, and then not assume that we can make the grid completely resilient or foolproof, but rather anticipate the outages and try to shorten the recovery period. And so that is an explicit program objective that we've built in to the program design. And that's just one example of some of the programs that we have going forward. I'm glad that Malavika mentioned about the operational barriers. We see a lot of gaps in capacity. Rehana also mentioned this. There is, what should I say, a very optimistic view about technology. We are very encouraged that technology costs are coming down, but in many cases, the application of technology hasn't produced the results, the intended results, to enhance community resilience. And often that is due to supply chain issues and also the local capacity for operation and maintenance. Just one example, we have visited remote communities in the Philippines and Indonesia. They had solar battery hybrid systems that were installed with the government budget. But then we were told that after 6 months, they stopped operating. They thought that they don't need to rely on the expensive transport and purchase of fuel or diesel fuel anymore. And they will have reliable electricity going forward, but that wasn't the case. And we said, why don't you repair it? And they said that they have to wait at least 6 months for the supplier to come from the capital, and they receive no training for ongoing operation maintenance. And so we, ADB, along with other partners such as ZIZ, KFW, the New Zealand Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Australia, DFAT, we are providing the capacity development needed to ensure that these technologies indeed deliver the results for community resilience. So that's an important aspect to build in to the planning, the master planning, and also project and program specific planning. That's my second point. The third and final point is the cross-sectoral approach that Rehana talked about. And going back to the costs, the resources are limited and we have to prioritize. And therefore, we have to capture the benefits and the funding opportunities that are provided to different sectors. We do have funding for health. We do have funding for education. We do have funding for transport. And these have to be combined for better planning so that we can bring in these resources together. One concrete example that we've been involved in is this development and proliferation of electric vehicles. People need transport, and many communities, they have fleets, for example, the village vehicles or the power utilities. The electric vehicles, I've been saying, and I had a presentation in ASEF 5 years ago, these are energy storage on wheels. So when we actually have a significant event in a vulnerable community, we are able to bring that stored electricity to the relief centers, help them charge their mobile phones so they have information access, and we can keep medicine and essential supplies chilled. So there is dedicated funding of government and assistance for transport needs for electric vehicles. We can actually have them charged through the solar PVs, and to tap this together with the effort on education, health, and energy. And that's one of the ways that we can overcome the financing barrier. I'll just keep it to these 3 points and happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Toru, for specifically highlighting the issues related to costs and cost effectiveness and how do we make an argument from that aspect. Our last panelist is Edward Neri, who is a Senior Science Research Specialist from Philippines Department of Energy, Renewable Energy Management Bureau. Edward, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ardia. So I would rather give the opportunity to the participants to ask the questions to the presenters, because I wanted to share with you one of the significant efforts of the Philippine Department of Energy in enhancing its power system resilience. This is through the competitive renewable energy zone process. This is in partnership with the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines and USAID and NREL. So CRES actually, as what we call it, is a proactive transmission planning approach that supports investment in large-scale transmission expansions and upgrades. So the goal is not only to accelerate the optimal use of indigenous RE resources in the Philippines, but also to scale up the resiliency of the power system. So meaning with the inherent strength of the RE, when I say inherent strength, I'm referring to the spatial diversification and contribution to the diverse generation mix coupled with microgrids. The key industries will be able to get back online quicker after a natural disaster. So if I may say, last year the Philippines CRES modelers actually identified 34 gigawatt of wind potential in 25 candidate CRESes. This would be by 2040 and will eventually be considered in the Philippines transmission development plan. That's it.
Hi, Edward. Sorry, I was not able to hear the last couple of minutes, but can you hear me?
Yes, I clearly.
Okay, for some reason I cannot hear anybody.
Yes.
Toru, can you please try speaking just to test?
Hello, yes. We're able to hear.
No, for some reason I cannot hear anybody. All right, this is we are testing resilience to the limit over here in this session for sure. But I guess you can hear me. So what I can do is we can start the question and answer session, and meanwhile, hopefully I can fix this. So I would request, we have about 45 minutes left in the session. So I would request participants to kindly start sending your question answers in the chat box. And specifically, if you have any questions to be addressed by specific panelists, do mention that in your question. But meanwhile, we have already received a few questions, and I'm happy to kickstart the discussion with that. One set of questions is around risk and the data issues around risk, both the quality of data, the availability and the affordability of data, but also the data which Rihanna highlighted on the not just a traditional data on hazards or exposures, but also vulnerability data, which is absolutely critical. So maybe some of you can take that question and address how, do you really feel there are issues on data? And if so, how can we work around it, specifically in the context of developing countries in Asia and the Pacific? Please be mindful, I cannot hear your answer. So I'm just posing a question. So maybe, I don't know, Malvika, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. I think data is always one of the, the most, I would say, critical inputs into any decision making. And exactly, I think the point that I was making was that the use of data in intelligent ways, I mean, basically the use of data combined with smart information technologies, artificial intelligence, sort of big data analysis can actually help really advance our knowledge of what are the risks and give us, that additional information so that we can plan and so that we can, not be always in the dark about what's happening next. But of course, gathering that data, I think, is always a challenge. And I think one issue to highlight is sort of the public-private partnerships. So I think there's an increasing focus on how we can intelligently combine different parties to create databases that that become open source, so people can feed into it. So
thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear a single word. So I'm just looking at your expression and guessing if it's over or not. Maybe I'll request also Toru and Rihanna to jump in and discuss this issue on data from your side, if you have anything to contribute.
I think, Malavika, you were in the middle. Do you want to finish?
No, I mean, I think I had sort of made the point that basically, I think there's definitely gathering data is always more important, more challenging than it seems to be in the beginning. But I think if we can find ways to create partnerships where different people can contribute to an open source platform, I think that can really be a big, for example, in this case with the Ile-de-France region, where it was public-private citizens, all of them gathering and plugging into 10,000 data sets coming together. Massive project. So yeah, I think there are ways to incentivize different parties to actually contribute to common data sets.
Yeah, I agree with Malavika, and the only thing partnerships and open platforms and so on in terms of both sharing data, but also as a way of verifying data. I think there's also ways in which we can perhaps look at using blockchain as a verification of data as well. And I think there are some really interesting examples there that we could look at, and we need to look at in terms of blockchain and verifying data. But I just wanted to add to that, and that's this whole question of social data and the quality of social data, and also that's not just a data question, but it's also a question of how do you quantify social impacts and social implications, and when it comes to questions like gender, this is a very hard thing to do, and there might be some correlation, but then causality, and you just get into this whole complicated area when it comes to social data, and the limitations of being able to quantify social data. So I guess here I think we do need to leave some space for qualitative data. I just think we really do need to find ways of incorporating qualitative data, whether it's through focus group discussions or whatever, and reflecting that in our work, and we do that in the energy space, in power systems and energy, in terms of socio-technical modeling approaches. I'm actually encouraging people, and I have used qualitative data to at least to back up certain arguments and so on. And this is very new in the engineering space and in EEE, where everything is a mathematical equation. But I think we just need to do it and stretch and see.
Just one thing on this. Yes, Argo, there's, as the other speakers pointed out, there's this issue about data availability, but also the sharing of data between sectors, and presenting that video in a visual or graphic way. One example, it's a while ago, but there was a joint study by ADB and World Bank and JICA covering the vulnerability from natural disasters and the increased risk of climate change in 4 major cities in Southeast Asia. And then that study overlaid the government's official for planning their the key, the roads and networks where it was expected to have increased flooding risk. So going from 1 in 50 years to 1 in 10 years, for example, that actually had a major impact on the master planning. And there were adjustments made because the roads would draw the communities around that and would put more people under risk. I don't see that as much in the energy sector yet. There's a lot of energy planning, but overlaying that with graphical information on the highly vulnerable areas is not something that's mainstreamed yet with the big energy players, at least in Southeast Asia, where I'm focusing on. Argo,
okay,
can you?
thank you, colleagues. I'm going to request that if we can take a very short pause of a minute, just I need to log out and log in order to hear any one of you. But meanwhile, it'll be good for us when you come back. It really won't. There's a couple of questions around issues on different qualities of resilience. Toru touched upon the issue on redundancy. Then Malvika talked about robustness and diversification. But these issues, these qualities are critical, but how do we bring these qualities together in a manner which is cost effective for a developing country? Maybe if we can on that. So I'll be back in a minute, hopefully, and system will work. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody, and thanks for the patience. Technology is finally working. In order to take forward the discussion, Edward, do you want to add something on the data side, which to complement what Toru and others said?
Yes, thank you, Arya. Actually, I just want to I'm agreeing with the challenge in data gathering, but I believe that it would be data gathering can be facilitated as long as there is security in the data, as long as we can guarantee the security to our partners and come up with a secured system and database. I think that would help a lot.
Thank you. Related to this question, there is on issues of climate data, and there is a specific question which talks about that there are a lot of uncertainties regarding climate change, as we all know. And what would be the best way to include such uncertainties of future climate impacts when we do planning for the power system, energy system itself. Do any one of you want to take that question? How do you factor uncertainties in planning for energy sector? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is a very tough question, very important one. It's very risky to depend on a certain climate model. Argo, you're an expert on this. I'm sure you have views to add. In the international development community, we usually take many models and try to come up with several cases. We try to avoid having a reference case because there is no such thing as a reference case for future climate change. It would be a band of possibilities. For example, wind speeds, areas affected, sea level rise, and it would be a band. And then it tries to look at the probabilities that particular segment, for example, if it's a transmission distribution line, would be affected. I didn't touch on this in my short remarks, but it was covered well, especially by Rehana, but also in the opening plenary. The support being extended and sort of the switch to the distributed model, that in itself will help a lot because we are over dependent on centralized, connected singular grid models, and one part of the transmission goes down and then entire districts and districts are affected. We saw this in Japan earlier, last year actually. The whole island of Hokkaido went down because a couple of power plants stopped. And therefore, I think we're taking the right approach. We're seeing these enormous cost reductions in solar and batteries, and to really take this opportunity to scale this up, especially in the most vulnerable areas, along with the capacity building and supply chain, ensuring that the supply chain is there. Then, even when those communities may be disconnected from the grid, they will be able to have essential supply of energy. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Toru. Any other panelists would like to take this question on uncertainties? How do you factor climate uncertainties in planning processes?
Yeah, perhaps if I could just add on to what Toru was saying there. And from an engineering perspective, if you're considering resilience, we need to approach the designing of our systems differently. That is, we usually design our systems to be reliable to credible events. And as engineers, these are N-1 or N-2 outages. But with the kind of catastrophes, if you like, that we are facing, and a lot of this driven by climate change, we really now have to design for high impact, low probability events. So what we are now calling N-X outages or catastrophic failures. So from an engineering design perspective, if you come at it from that perspective, then this has implications for planning. I very much agree with Toru's point as well. And I think this whole transition that we're seeing, the low carbon energy transition that we're seeing, it really, a lot of it, what is really exciting to me is distributed generation and how this can, and that sort of, that interaction between the distribution system and the rest of the system has the potential to deal with a lot of the engineering issues and possibly planning issues as well. Taking a little bit of a leap here, I think this is said repeatedly, and sometimes it's just becomes a slogan, and that is participatory planning and so on. And I think we really need to look at this in a very concrete way in terms of the planning in the energy sector. We can't just plan for the old grid anymore. We can't plan for the old centralized grid. There are new technologies that are coming on board. There are new trends. There are new challenges, such as disasters. And the grid is changing. We need to acknowledge that. And I think we need to also encourage the changes that will help meet some of these challenges. And that has to be reflected in planning. I guess in a way, it's sort of a design up and bottom up approach to it.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add on actually to this discussion by saying that I think there's the role of the private sector to come in and take on some of the risks and take on some of the operation, the capital expenditure, right? So what are the ways in which the private sector can actually, as I mentioned, become a project developer and operate certain microgrids or mini grids, which, where it takes on the energy as a service model? And what are the regulations that allow that to happen, so that some of the risk and some of the, we hear time and again, we hear that redundancy is expensive, but let others take on that risk. So the capital, the private sector is willing to actually take on some of that risk, take on some of that capital risk by providing energy as a service and sharing the burden. So let that happen, create these energy as a service models, create these shared critical infrastructure models that allow that to happen. So, yeah.
Thank you, Malvika. Well, that's a very important point to get the private sector in. So what I'm really hearing is that planning itself, we need to perhaps embrace a different style in our planning, which incorporates top-down, but also equally bottom-up approaches, an iterative process, which factors in uncertainties. Just because we're not certain doesn't mean we cannot plan for certain things. And as Rehanna, you suggested also the importance of looking not only at low impact, high probability events, but the other way around of how do you factor in high impact, low probability events, because these events will only become more frequent with climate change. A question has come in which talks about that many of you has already mentioned about diversification. So is diversification a key for strengthening resilience? And if so, then how do we go about how do we convince our decision makers to really diversify? And what are the pros and cons of diversification from a resilience angle? Do anybody want to take this question? Edward, do you have any suggestion from your side? Or anybody else? It's open question.
Well, yes, I'd just like to emphasize that the Philippine Department of Energy is actually open into this kind of policy, the diversification of the power system, since we are actually promoting the renewable energy, and we're giving importance to it. And as if I may highlight it, just last recently, we were able to implement all the policy mechanisms that will actually accelerate the renewable energy in the Philippines.
Thank you. Anyone else from the diversification?
Yeah, no, just a general comment. I think we've not so much looked at that from in the power systems, but in general, I think when we are looking at some of the clients who are who are trying to understand what's happening in their supply chain over time, I think, as I was mentioning in my presentation, they are all designed to maximize efficiency and not to minimize risk. So our systems are all built on maximizing efficiency, getting the best value out of a situation, and therefore the diversification actually means more cost. So that's often overlooked. So I think if we correct the whole financing, how we measure the risks of climate change, we factor it into our systems, then immediately those diversification solutions will become more feasible. And it's really important to actually diversify and maybe reduce a little bit of efficiency to create those buffers and localize your supply chains and improve the diversity and create longer term relationships with various suppliers. So just a sort of more general comment there that, yeah, it is absolutely important, even at the cost of efficiency.
Thank you, Malvika. Anybody else? Toru, yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this has been a theme for energy planners, especially for a long time. You know, this diversification, trying to not be over reliant on one or two specific sources. This, you know, in our energy field, we've been calling this energy security, to maintain energy security of the country and the system. And so here, I wouldn't really emphasize diversification, but rather it's to ensure that there's sufficient indigenous supply of energy, and that's what renewable energy really helps, because it is more evenly distributed. The fuel is there for renewable energy. Then the challenge is about supply chain and capacity. So the point that Malavika made, we need to invest in this. Before, the capex was higher for renewable energy, but that's not an issue anymore. There's been so many studies in the past 2 years how an aggressive shift to renewable energy can really be done either cost neutral or even with benefits. By 2035, we can change the entire system. I think UC Berkeley just came up with a new study that US can shift 90% to renewable energy by 2035 with no incremental cost. So less on capex, but really the investment on supply chains. So again, I would say it's about making sure that there's enough source of energy and equipment that can be brought into your markets and the communities when there are global supply disruptions, such as what we're experiencing now.
Thank you, Toru.
I'd like to just make a quick comment as well. And I just want to approach it from a slightly different angle, because I think it's really important that governments and planners also understand or are able to recognize diversification when it is happening outside their area of operation or their area of functioning. And I think this is because there is technology out there, and people will try and find ways to also access and use some of these technologies if they think it's going to solve some problems or improve their lives. You know, I think this is part of the experience in rural electrification in countries like Bangladesh, where you had these solar home systems just keep cropping up to solve electricity access. And you know, what is it? Some 25 million homes have been serviced by these solar home systems. And now there's, I was in Bangladesh, when was it? A few months ago, and talking to both the Ministry of Power, but also a number of other NGOs and so on. Now they've got DC boxes, and they're throwing these DC boxes into the community and so forth. So as a part of this, there is a transition, there is a low carbon transition, and there are technologies that are coming on board that are not necessarily the ones that the government agencies, the ministries of power, the planners deal with. And in that sense, there is diversification. And the problem is and some of it is good. This is disruptive. It's clearly disruptive. So another aspect of diversification is disruptive technology. And I think the challenge is, especially where it works, to provide regulation and provide a framework, provide policy, regulation, and so on to sustain some of the positive impetus of this disruptive diversification that is taking place. And planners have to be aware of this.
Thank you. So what I'm essentially getting is, yes, of course, diversification is an important strategy for building resilience, but it cannot be seen as the only strategy for building resilience. there are a combination of issues. We have to look at it. And more importantly, these issues need to be very context specific, because at the local level, the capacity is very different. Availability of financing might be very different. Technology availability is very different. So it's all very context specific issues on how you approach resilience planning in different countries. A related question, maybe, I think, Malvika, you alluded to the issue on bringing in financing. And earlier in your presentation, you did talk about the importance of disclosure of financial disclosure of risk. How do you see moving forward as financial institutions are going to disclose their climate risk more and more? What do you see as the advantages of that in bringing in investments for resilience, essentially?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And I think part of the reason that capital is not flowing into this sector as much as it should, or it's not flowing into resilience type investments, is because often they don't meet the ROI criteria, right? So sometimes, I mean, what we encounter is that a lot of companies will blindly apply return on investment criteria, and then suddenly a lot of the investments will not come through and pass the very narrowly defined ROI criteria, because they have not actually looked at the full risks and benefits of this kind of investment. So I think there's a really increasing urgency to correct for that, to basically say that there have to be common ways in which we come up with these approaches. And so I earlier talked about the TCFD, and I think that's doing a great job of sort of pulling together this information. And similar, I mean, there's a myriad of examples. I think the case in point is the carbon price. Of course, there is no one carbon price, and I think that keeps changing. And companies internally are starting to apply. And I think certain oil and gas companies yesterday raised their internal carbon price to $100, which is a great encouraging sign in the right direction. But basically, what's happening is this failure of companies to systemically price in the real risks of climate and be able to, because and I think you mentioned also, Rehan, I mean, the risks are so, there's low impact, high probability events, or high impact, low probability events. I mean, it's very difficult to actually plan and price in these in the future. People don't know how to grapple with it. People don't know how to take action on these risks. So they go unmeasured. And then when it actually happens, you suddenly, you have toppling of entire value chains taking place. So I think it's really, really important that this whole narrowly defined ROI is changed. And of course, that's now changing. I think banks are taking ESG really seriously. All the large banks are now starting to incorporate this into their loans, and they're holding out on loans if their portfolio has not taken this into account. So I think there's obviously a good direction, but I think that needs to be faster somehow.
Thank you. So what I understand is, do you see this movement ultimately being reflected in actual contracts, where you're rewriting the section on force majeure in contracts to acknowledge these issues and actually, in case if supply chains are disrupted, for example, then people are accountable for it. I mean, do you see that happening in the long run? I mean.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, and not only I think force majeure, but also I think on the planning side of things, in terms of making investments in infrastructure, one needs to take the right kind of dimensions so that for example, distributed energy becomes more viable than purchasing. So, for example, if you're buying electricity from a private operator using PPA, I mean, comparing it to a centralized grid purchase, I mean, there are lots of different types of contracts where the options, how you evaluate options changes depending on how you calculate the return on investment, and that return on investment calculation needs to change. So to account for those differences or for those future risks.
Thank you. There are a whole bunch of questions on looking from a very extreme event point of view, disaster point of view. And actually, Toru, you did mention in your opening remarks about, yes, of course, we want to reduce risk through our investments, but we cannot reduce risks 100%. There will always be certain risk which is existing, but how do you put in measures to manage that residual risk, which is existing through various kind of activities. So the specific question, perhaps this is for Edward, are there any contingency plans on the solar energy systems on off-grid areas in the Philippines? So does the solar systems are factoring in basic contingency planning, disaster preparedness measures in the Philippines context? Do you have any examples from there?
Thank you, Arya. Regarding the off-grid projects like solar in the Philippines, I would rather say on the policy aspect, the DOE is actually implementing the renewable portfolio standards for off-grid areas. So we are actually helping the local generators to come up with their optimal mix of energy, which should be there should be a 1% from their net sales coming from the RE.
Thank you. Anybody else from your experiences on building in consciously preparedness measures in energy sector projects to make sure that if a disruption happens, then the system is able to still continue its basic function to some extent?
Just, I guess, a brief comment and more of a question as well to Toru, which is, I think you had described this situation earlier where, the distributed energy systems didn't work because of the operation and maintenance challenges. So, I mean, just a remark there that I think shouldn't those types of situations have taken into account a contract that the vendor should have, someone should have been covering the O&M side of things. So, it should have been built in, and then someone would have been responsible for those systems working for X number of years and even longer perhaps. And maybe that should be extended as a way to improve resilience of the systems.
Argo, can I just respond to Malavika's question and point?
Please go ahead, yes.
Yeah, absolutely, Malavika. That's exactly what needs to happen, this sustainable business model where somebody is responsible for the proper operation maintenance. But then we have to ensure that they are also getting paid. And that's the problem with very remote areas where the initial cost may be high. And especially if there is a need for physical operation maintenance, then the travel costs are high. So it may not be a sustainable business model without some kind of support mechanism designed centrally. So that's the need for a regulatory scheme. And we see that as a challenge in many of our energy access programs, trying to connect the last 5%, 10%.
Yeah.
Thank you, Toru. Related to this question, another important residual risk management measure is, of course, looking at insurance products. And of course, specifically for, as Rihanna, you said, for the high impact, low probability kind of tail end events, which cannot be covered by regular maintenance cost or your contingency reserves for budget of a government. So do you guys have any experience of where disaster risk insurance are being used in the energy sector context, or some of the issues which you think we'll encounter if we are moving towards that direction as one of the solutions, not the only solution, of course? Anybody? Okay, of course, it boils down to a whole bunch of other issues, looking at the importance of having the right kind of data sets, which allows you to do robust modeling exercises, having the right regulatory systems in place. So I think that's, of course, an important aspect of it. I'm conscious of time and we are coming to a close. We have got 8 minutes left. So maybe I will request, just to wrap up, that each of the speakers and panelists, if you can just take a minute time to convey what is, from your perspective, what is the key message that we can take back from this session, considering you already presented certain ideas, but also we discussed for the last 45 minutes a rich set of ideas. So from your side, any key message you would like to convey to us? I don't know who would like. Malvika, do you want to start, please?
Sure. I think for me, I mean, this has been a really interesting discussion, with the panelists, and I've learned a lot as well. And I think one of the things that I'm taking away is the need to. I think we've talked about, sort of community resilience. We've talked about the challenges of reaching the last 5%, etc. And for me, I think the main, I think food for thought is what are the, so I would say that these kind of cross-sectoral or public-private partnerships, I think, are really great solutions. But you really need to think carefully about creating incentives to tap those synergies. So what are the right ways in which you're not overpaying to solve these kind of, for example, O&M challenges? What are the kinds of incentives that different players in different parts of the ecosystem need to create to come together successfully? Because resilience is all about coming together, as whether it's as a community or as a business or as some kind of partnership. So what are the types of mechanisms that we can use in innovative ways in going forward that we haven't thought of, in which we can successfully create partnerships where different parties bear the risk and create this insurance safety net for the entire society? I think that's something to think about for, so of course the common knowledge is the private sector, will cost money, and the public sector, etc. I mean, there's all these differences, but I think it's time to overcome and figure out some good solutions that practically work. So something to do in the future is to think through this.
Thanks, that's very useful. So essentially coming together, and in the process, how do we create incentive for each stakeholders who are involved in this entire ecosystem, so that end of the day, we all know that each one of us is responsible for our bit of resilience. That's absolutely critical. Edward, if I can come to you and request for one message, but before that, there is one question, perhaps you can take this up, is what is the status of implementation of the Philippines renewable energy markets, which was discussed earlier? Do you have any comment on that? If not, we can just make an overall comment also. Thank you.
Well, yes, the Philippine renewable energy market policies or the guidelines has actually been issued recently. So this will actually help us guide on this will be the platform wherein there will be a exchange of RECs or the renewable energy certificates. So this had been issued already. It will be it is already set for implementation.
Thanks for that update. And do you have any key message for us, the participants, to take back?
Yes. Okay. As someone coming from the government sector, a policy formulator, and being one of the most vulnerable countries to disasters, we need to ensure that our energy systems are disaster resilient, and that resiliency is an integral component of our country's policies and programs. That's what I can say.
Okay, that's absolutely critical. So the importance of strengthening disaster resilience, but where we are not seeing resilience as an extra thing to do, but very much a part and parcel of decision-making, planning, policy, implementation in the energy sector itself. So you essentially, you don't separate resilience and development separately, but look at it holistically. I think that's an absolutely critical point. Thank you, Edward, for that. Rihanna, from your side, last comment.
Yeah, I guess I want to, in terms of these high impact, low probability events, which are actually becoming increasingly probable, I just wanted to emphasize again the importance of the role of government, especially in terms of framing policy and planning, providing policy and planning frameworks sort of as broad guidelines, if you like, and of course regulating where necessary as well. And I think the insurance case is a bit of an example, is a case in point. I mean, in Australia, for example, we had this massive bushfires in January. I mean, millions of acres of land and animals dead, and a few hundred people died and houses burned. It was really horrific, one of the worst we've ever experienced. And how does the insurance industry adapt to these things? And there has been some adaptation, clearly, but when you have these kinds of events, the government had to step in, and of course they have these packages, but they also need to give some guidance in terms of industry as a whole and how industry has to adapt, such as the insurance industry. And I guess, just emphasize that point, and the other points that speakers have made, the importance of an integrated approach. And I guess the main message that I ended up with, as Malavika said, there are opportunities that are also presented in this particular conjuncture that we face. The COVID pandemic, energy transition, there are multiple things that are crisscrossing, and it does give us the opportunity. And I think in the energy space, with the energy transition, drawing from some of the experiences of the energy transition, such as distributed generation, how that can be replicated in other sectors, what are the lessons for other sectors, not so much replicated, but what are the lessons for other sectors to build back and to bring everyone with us.
Thank you, Rana, for highlighting the important role governments would need to play, and looking at the entire spectrum of risk and bringing in different stakeholders to address different aspects of risk, but also recognizing that we do have a very unique opportunity currently, and we should be able to utilizing it to push the agenda, at least maybe in the context of the COVID recovery at least. So Toru, lastly, from your side and specifically from ADB's perspective, any last words we should take forward?
Yeah, I really agree to what Edward said, and Argo, how you summarized about resilience being a core, integral part of energy planning going forward. As I mentioned at the very beginning, in the new normal, I really fear for the children without any access to education, and the health workers in hospitals with no power to run the ventilators. The divide will just become even more amplified going forward without a reliable energy system. And so, the recognizing that energy, the resilience of energy system is so crucial to community resilience, and therefore the need to look at this from a health, education, transport, other perspectives, and try to pool that money into the funding into a holistic planning process. And as Malavika said, support the government so that they can improve their regulatory systems to try to crowd in, pool private financing resources to share some of that responsibility and risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Toru. So moving from essentially resilience of energy sector to resilient energy sector, I think that's absolutely critical for us. So I would like to thank each one of you once again for your time and really rich discussion. My apologies for not being able to have Chitwan on the call. Once again, Chitwan, you accept your apologies for that. But I hope everybody found this session useful. And this is just a beginning. There are two sessions, session tomorrow and day after also in the resilience track. So please do attend those sessions. And once again, thank you from all of us. Thanks.
Thank you.